France. After a period of religious conflict, peace was restored to most of France when Henry of Navarre became King Henry IV in 1589. He founded the Bourbon dynasty, which ruled France with some interruptions until the early 1800s. During most of that time, Bourbon kings maintained an absolute monarchy that was limited by monarchs throughout Europe. Henry IV was a Protestant, but he converted to Catholicism to quiet his Catholic opponents. Believing that people's religious beliefs need not interfere with their loyalty to the government, Henry issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598 to reassure the Huguenots, the name given to France's Protestants. The edict allowed Protestant worship to continue in areas where the Protestants were a majority, but barred Protestant worship in Paris and other Catholic strongholds. The edict granted Huguenots the same civil rights as Catholics. These actions ended religious strife and enabled France to rebuild itself. With the help of its Minister of Finance, Henry restored to the crown's treasury, repaid roads and bridges, and supported trade and industry. He also tried to restore discipline in the army and bring order to the government bureaucracy. All of these royal policies were put into effect without the approval of the Estates General, and thus laid the foundation for the absolute rule of the later Bourbon monarchs. Cardinal Richelieu. When Henry IV was assassinated in 1610, his 9-year-old son, Louis VIII, became king. Louis's mother, Marie de Medici, was regent for the next 7 years. In 1617, Louis gained the throne by force and exiled his mother from court. A few years later, he gave power to one of her advisors, Cardinal Richelieu. Gradually, Louis gave complete control of the government to the cardinal, who set out to build an absolute monarchy in France. To realize this goal, Richelieu had to reduce the power of the nobles and the Huguenots. When Louis XIII came to the throne, the nobility was in the control of the provinces. Nobles collected taxes, administered justice, appointed local officials, and even made alliances with foreign governments. To end the nobles' power, Richelieu destroyed their fortified castles and stripped them of their local administrative functions. The nobility retained social prestige, while authority in local government affairs was given to special agents of the crown, known as intendants. Non-nobles, Richelieu believed, would assert themselves and challenge the king's authority. Richelieu also sought to take away the military and territorial rights given to the Huguenots by the threat to the French state. In 1625, radical Huguenots revolted against Louis XIII. After the defeat of Protestant forces at the seaport of La Rochelle in 1628, Richelieu took away the Huguenots' right to independent fortified towns. The Huguenots were, however, allowed to keep their religious freedom. Having weakened the monarchy's internal enemies, Richelieu sought to make France the supreme power in Europe. He strengthened the French army and then took steps to build up the economy. In order to strengthen national unity, he supported French culture. Under Richelieu's direction, France's leading writers in 1635 organized the French Academy. The Academy received a royal charter to establish fixed rules for the language and render the French language not only elegant but also capable of treating all arts and sciences. In the following century, French became the preferred language of European diplomacy and culture. Louis XIV is recognized as the most powerful Bourbon monarch. He became king in 1643 at the age of 5. At first, France was ruled by his 2 regents, his mother, Anne of Austria, and Cardinal Mazarin, Richelieu's successor. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis announced that he would run his own government. He was then 23 years old. The 72-year reign of Louis XIV was the longest in European history. It set the style for European monarchies during the 1600s and 1700s. During his own lifetime, Louis was known as the Sun King, around whom the royalty and nobility of Europe revolved. He set up a lavish court and surrounded himself with pomp and pageantry. Louis's monarchy had power as well as style. Although Louis relied on a bureaucracy, he was the source of all political authority in France. In one of his audiences, he is said to have boasted, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. Absolute rule. Louis emphasized a strong monarchy because of his fear of disorder without it. As a child, he had lived through the Fronde, a series of uprisings by nobles and peasants that occurred between 1648 and 1653. During the Fronde, royal troops lost control of Paris and mobs rioted in the streets. The young Louis and his regents were called to give an account of their actions before the Parliament, or the Supreme Court of Law in France. The Fronde was crushed, but Louis never forgot this attempt to limit royal power. As king, he intended never to let it happen again. Louis XIV's feelings about absolute monarchy were later supported by Jacques Pousset, the leading church official of France during the 1600s. Bousset's defense of the divine origins of monarchy became one of the most famous justifications of absolute rule. He wrote, "What grandeur that a single man should embody so much! Behold this holy power, paternal and absolute, contained in a single head. You can see the image of God in the king, and you have the idea of royal majesty." According to Bousset, subjects had no right to revolt even if the king was unjust. Kings need account to no one except God, but they should act with humility and restraint. Court life. After the Fronde, Louis made plans to live outside of Paris. He moved his court and government to a new palace that he built at Versailles. No expense was spared, for Versailles was to demonstrate the wealth, power, and glory of France. The palace had elegant royal apartments, sweeping staircases, mirrored halls, priceless tapestries, and lavish formal salons and dining rooms. There were offices for government bureaucrats as well as tiny cramped rooms where officials lived. As many as 10,000 people lived at Versailles. Outside the palace were acres of formal gardens. In this setting, Louis felt secure from the danger of Parisian mobs. Here he had the nobility attend his court so that he could control them. Louis had them wait on him in a round of daily court rituals. The nobility depended on the king's favor for pensions, court posts, and protection from creditors. In exchange for ending the nobles' power, Louis freed them from taxation. To nobles and non-nobles alike, he sold many offices with salaries. The sale of offices provided needed royal income but became a long-term drain on the treasury. Government policies. Louis continued the efforts of Henry IV and Richelieu to strengthen the power of the monarch and the state. He followed the tradition of Richelieu and chose his top advisors not from the nobility, but from middle-class families. Although Louis was an absolute monarch, he was not able to simply change the traditions of his country's feudal past. Legal systems varied throughout France. Private tolls and customs were levied on goods moving from one province to another. Weights and measures were not uniform. There were separate authorities and districts for financial, judicial, religious, and administrative affairs. If Louis had tried to change these practices, it would have endangered his throne. Instead, the king kept the traditional ways, but added them to the new administrative offices and practices. Two key people aided Louis XIV in his efforts: Jean-Baptiste Colbert and François-Michel Letellier, the Marquis de Louvois. As economic and financial minister, Colbert followed mercantilist policies to promote trade and industry. Louvois served as minister of war and helped make France's army the strongest in Europe. Taxation. While reforming some aspects of government practice, Louis failed to adjust the complicated and unjust tax system. The poor carried most of the tax burden, while nobles, clergy, and government officials were exempt from many payments. Independent tax collectors often made large profits, but they were allowed to continue this practice since the money was needed to support the army. The unreformed tax system heightened the economic differences between the regions of France. Since any visible improvement in one's farm or household might lead to higher tax payments, there was little desire to improve one's output. The tax system encouraged people to move from heavily taxed regions to regions with lower taxes. As a result, heavily taxed regions became poorer. Religious policy. Louis regarded the Huguenots as a threat to his absolute monarchy. Many Huguenots were military leaders and prosperous merchants. They often controlled local commerce. In spite of their high social standing, the Huguenots faced mounting persecution from Louis's government. The king wanted the Huguenots to accept Catholicism. He believed that, in this way, they would prove their loyalty to the throne. In 1685, the Edict of Nantes was repealed. Huguenots could no longer practice their religion, and their children had to become Catholics. The result of the king's policy was the emigration of about 200,000 Huguenots to such places as the Netherlands, England, and England's American colonies. Many of these people contributed to economic growth and prosperity where they settled. Expansion. Louis XIV pursued a bold and active foreign policy. Other European rulers were fearful of Louis's desire for expansion and, as a result, allied in opposition to France. At the end of Louis XIV's reign, Europe was concerned about the succession to the Spanish throne. It was expected that Charles II of Spain would die without an heir. Both France and Austria had claims to the throne. The rest of Europe was alarmed that the balance of power would be disrupted if France inherited Spain's vast empire. Prior to Spanish King Charles II's death, the European powers worked out a plan to divide the Spanish Empire. The will of Charles II upset this plan by stating that the entire empire should remain intact and passed to Louis XIV's grandson, Philippe of Anjou. Louis XIV accepted the provisions of the will. When Charles II died in 1700, Philip of Anjou became King Philip V of Spain. As a result, Europe was plunged into a conflict known as the War of Spanish Succession. Conflict. The War of Spanish Succession lasted from 1701 to 1713. During the conflict, England, the Dutch Netherlands, and Austria led a grand alliance of nations against France and Spain. Peace finally came with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. England and the Dutch Netherlands recognized Philip V as King of Spain on the condition that France and Spain never be united under one crown. England gained trade advantages with the Spanish colonies. France, however, was forced to surrender Acadia, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland to England. The War of Spanish Succession drained the French treasury, increased poverty, and created opposition to Louis's rule. Louis XIV's legacy. France enjoyed one of its most brilliant cultural periods under Louis XIV. Builders and artisans designed and decorated palaces and churches. Artists and playwrights portrayed the daily life of the king's court, the nobility, and the lower classes. Louis's building projects and his wars, however, had left the country near financial ruin. The weakening of the French nobility also had its costs. The nobles lost their ability to govern, but not the desire for power. The peasants and the middle class resented the privileges and wealth of the nobles. After Louis XIV's death in 1715, the nobility sought to expand its power under Louis's great-grandson, Louis XV. Conflicts between the nobles and the middle and lower classes would bring France to the brink of revolution.